Good morning again, and welcome to another class on the book of Proverbs. Today we will be talking about a subject called friends and friendships. And Proverbs is mentioned in the book of Proverbs, friend or friendships is mentioned 12, 14 times, depending upon which translation you use. And we'll be looking at a good portion of those texts today. So welcome, Brian.
Good to be back.
Good to see you. And let's look at some of those things right after we have our prayer. Dear Lord, thank you for today. Thank you for this class. Especially, we thank you for the wisdom that you provide for us. And you've provided for us all down through the years. And we ask that you help us to implant it in our mind and in our lives. We ask for blessings on our country. We ask for blessings on the congregation here, and we ask for blessings on our family and our friends and our neighbors. You are a gracious God. Help us to honor that and reflect that in the things that we do. In Christ's name, amen.
Amen.
Okay, Brian, I'm going to put you on the spot to begin with. Are you ready?
Okay, let's go.
Here we go. Okay. For God so loved the
World.
very good, that he chose a very small nation, which was the nation of
Israel.
This is good. But out of all the people in Israel, he chose a simple 12 men to be his
Apostles.
very good. But out of those 12, he chose, you're ahead of me now, 3 more, and they were
Peter, James, and John.
Peter, James, and John. But even out of those 3, there was the disciple whom Jesus loved, and that was John. It seems like, with this topic of friends and friendships, it seems like that even Jesus had a best friend. It just seems that way. So, with that in mind, let's look at some of the things that have to do with friendship. The first thing we're going to talk about now is choosing a friend. How do you choose a friend? Well, there's a couple of proverbs that give us a little hint to that. One is, the righteous choose their friends carefully, but the way of the wicked leads them astray. And there's another one that says, one who has an unreliable friend soon comes to ruin, but there's a friend who sticks closer than a brother. You know, when we choose a friend, we have to be careful, the Bible says, and make sure that you choose right. Well, in the Bible, we look for some examples of that. And there's some good examples and some bad examples. We're going to start off first with a
bad example. That's right. You know, and one of the fascinating things to me about Scripture, but especially the Old Testament, is so many of the stories that we get in the narrative as they're telling the story of the nation of Israel. So many of the stories that we get are of those that sinned against God and against the law. And so we're kind of learning what not to do. Mm-hmm. And we get a really good example of that in the life of Rehoboam, who was the son of King Solomon. Now, Solomon would have been a tough act for anybody to follow.
Right.
The nation of Israel reached its height under the reign of King Solomon. All of the promises that God made to the children of Israel were fulfilled during the reign of King Solomon. So he'd be a tough act to follow. So Rehoboam, his son, is almost seemingly, based on the Bible narrative in 1 Kings, is presented with an opportunity. See, up to this point, there were already, and really for hundreds of years now, there was already starting to be a divide in the nation of Israel between the Judah and Benjamin and everybody else, right? So, and we refer to them as the northern versus the southern tribes. Well, this kind of came to a head right at the beginning, it seems, of Rehoboam's reign following Solomon. And he's approached by these northern tribes to cut their taxes, if we were going to bottom line
Yeah.
it. They basically Solomon had placed heavy burdens to fund his kingdom on these people, and they were saying, hey, we need a break. And Rehoboam tells them to go away, and he consults with his father's advisors first. You can imagine the gray hairs that would have surrounded King Solomon and his court. And they say, hey, good idea to listen to these people, and if you do that, you'll be incredibly popular, and it'll probably go a lot smoother. And we might be able to forestall all of this division that we've seen happening in the nation. Rehoboam then turns to the ones he grew up with, his buddies, the people he'd hung out with probably his whole life, and now he happened to be their boss. And he says, well, what do you think I should do? And they said, you need to man up. You need to show them who's boss.
Just get tough.
You need to get tough. You need to lay down the law. And that's exactly what he disregards the older counselors, and instead he ignored the advice, according to 1 Kings 12. He ignored the advice of the elders which they had given him, and consulted with the young men who'd grown up with him and served him. And just as had been prophesied, we had a division.
Yes.
It was a bad idea.
Well, that's an example of choosing the wrong friends. And we have a good example on the other side of this coin, and that is when you choose correctly. Here's a story that we all know, we've heard it from our childhood up, and that is the story of David and Goliath. And David, right after he has killed Goliath, Saul, the king, is asking, who is this guy? And so he brings David in, and he asks him, well, now, who's your parents? What family you're from? And he's talking to David and just trying to find out who this kid is, who all of a sudden has upstaged all the soldiers because nobody was willing to go out and fight. And here's this young kid that went out and killed Goliath. And so David tells him about his family. And here's a verse. It says, now it came about that when he had finished speaking to Saul, that Jonathan is Saul's son. Mm-hmm. Now Jonathan is, at this point in time, already a seasoned warrior. He had fought a group of Philistines himself and had won. God had given him the strength to do that, and he had given God the credit for doing that. And he had his own armor bearer, and so he was a seasoned warrior. He is probably at least 10 years older than David. Mm-hmm. And it says now that Jonathan committed himself to David after he had seen what David did, and he also had seen this young kid conversing with his father, and Jonathan must have been watching this, and he sees that, and it says, Jonathan committed himself to David, and Jonathan loved him as himself. And Saul took him that day and did not let him return back to his father Jesse. And then Jonathan made a covenant with David. So it wasn't just he liked the kid. He must have taken him aside and said, look, let's spend some time together. And whatever this covenant was, it was deep, and it traveled and went with them throughout Jonathan's entire lifetime. And it said, because he loved him as himself. Now, having a friend and a mentor even who is like 10 or maybe 15 years older than you are, and you're a young kid, and even though you're brave and all of that, to have somebody pay attention to you is really an encouraging event for a child, for a young man. Have you ever had somebody
I have.
like that?
You know, it's interesting as you were talking about that, Garth. I was incredibly blessed early in my married life. So I'm a little older than David was at that time with Jonathan, perhaps. But I was really blessed. We moved to Orlando very early in our marriage and started worshiping with a church there, and just became very close with some dear friends, Ralph and Vicki Klein, there. And Ralph was, I'm pretty sure he was close to 10 years older than I was. He would already started his career, had a great job at Disney. And what was really fascinating about Ralph is he hadn't grown up in the church, whereas Ruth and I had. And he had such a different perspective about the importance of faith, and he was all in for God, and I got into a relationship with Ralph at a really important time in my adult life.
Yeah.
And looking back on that now, he made me a better man as a result of that interaction. And I've often thanked him and thanked God for Ralph being in my life.
Oh, that's great. Well, I'm sure Jonathan and David had exactly the same kind of relationship, because Jonathan would do things for David. Mm-hmm. He would tell David exactly what his father Saul, Jonathan's father, was thinking about doing and how he felt about David at the time, and he would keep David out of trouble, and they were extremely close. So it's wonderful when you choose a friend who takes you under their wing and takes care of you and mentors you. And it's things like that that even big brothers, big sisters organizations are supposed to do. It's like the ladies program that does that, and the one that we have for men as far as Brothers Keepers. All that is kind of, in a way, been put on standby, but the needs are still there.
Sure has.
Okay, now here's another example. And the verse is this: do not forsake your friend or a friend of your family, and do not go to your relative's house when disaster strikes. You're better a neighbor nearby than a relative far away. Now there's an example of this, of honoring the friend of your family or friend of your father, and it is the story of Mephibosheth. Now, it says David, at the end of Saul and Jonathan's life, they had been killed in battle, and now David is the king, and he's thinking about the past, and he says this: is there anyone still left in the house of Saul, so that I could show him kindness, and get this, for Jonathan's sake? He is still feeling that bond and that commitment and that covenant that he had with Jonathan.
Different from the way all the nations around him would have reacted to that.
Yeah.
I mean, they would have wiped out the previous ruler's family in its entirety, and he's looking to help him.
Yeah, and so he asked this question, and he was given the answer. He said, there is still this son of Jonathan, and this son, his name is Mephibosheth, and Mephibosheth, when he was a very young child, was being carried by his nurse and was running. He fell and was crippled in his feet, and so therefore he had been a cripple his entire life. And when David found that out, he said, I am going to have him come and eat at my table, at the king's table. And from then on, Jonathan came and lived at the very palace where David lived. Not that wonderful?
It is. It's an amazing story.
Yeah. Okay, here's another one.
Yeah.
And this shows up a lot, doesn't it?
It does. And not just because my wife is named Ruth do I love the story of Ruth and Naomi.
Very good.
But it's a story about the power of the bond of family, but in this case, not by blood, but by kinship. And it is so amazingly portrayed in this story of Ruth and Naomi that we read in the book of Ruth. They were Jews, they were in a foreign land. Naomi loses her husband and then subsequently loses her two sons as well. And she has these two daughters-in-law. And the thing for them to do was for them to go back to their respective families, because in that time and for most of history, if you were a widow, you were in very dire straits.
That's right.
There was no safety net for that. So that's what Naomi wisely suggested that they do. Ruth would not go. Mm-hmm. And which is what she says is what we see here before us in Ruth chapter 1, verse 16 and 17. But Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried.
Wow.
She didn't need to do that. It would have been much easier for her to go back home, because what the road they have ahead of them, as you read the book of Ruth, is difficult and full of hardship and danger. But Ruth wouldn't have it. She was going to stick to Naomi because she felt that deep bond of kinship or friendship even.
So friends of the family, friends of friends. It's important to choose the best friends, and so that is one of the topics that the book of Proverbs covers now. Now here's an interesting verse. Proverbs 18:24, a person with too many friends comes to ruin, but there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. Now, when I first read that, and I used the New American Standard, that's the translation I usually use for most of my study. And I read that, and I thought, can you really have too many friends? And why would too many friends cause you to come to ruin? Well, then I looked real closely, and if you notice that the words too many are actually in italics, and that means that they're really, as such, not specifically in the text. So I turned to a couple of other different translations. The NIV says this: the one who has unreliable friends soon comes to ruin. Well, that makes a little more sense. And then I looked at the RSV. It says there are friends who pretend to be friends, but there's a friend who sticks closer than a brother. It's important that we have friends who give us advice, who talk to us, who listen to us, who help us, they comfort us. And a relative may give good advice, but they don't necessarily stick close to you. They may not, but just because they're kin to you doesn't mean that they're bound to you forever. But a good friend is one that goes even beyond that. They go the second mile. And choosing or being a friend, and actually these two are kind of the same thing. In order to have a deep relationship, it's got to go both ways. In Proverbs 22:11, it says, one who loves a pure heart and who speaks with grace will have the king for his friend. I mean, it's noticed by other people, even all the way to the top, Solomon says. One who loves a pure heart and speaks with grace. I love this word. It made me immediately think of this particular verse. And it's in Luke 4:22. And it said, all the people, and this is talking about Jesus being at the early part of his ministry, and all the people were speaking well of him and were admiring the gracious words which were coming from his lips. And yet they were saying, is this Joseph's son? They're kind of confused. We've watched this kid grow up, and all of a sudden, he was saying things that were different than the scribes and the Pharisees. He talked like he knew what he was talking about. He spoke with authority. The Sermon on the Mount, the text right at the end says that. But not only was he saying important things, the way he was talking captivated the people. And so we hear about, right off the bat, there are people who would sit for, in one case, for 3 days without food just to hear what he had to say. And I'm convinced it was not just the things he was saying, but the way he was saying it. It was his attitude. There's a verse in Hebrews. It's in the first chapter. It's the 9th verse. I've read through Hebrews many times. I read through that verse and I just keep going. But about 10 years ago, it was brought to my attention the depths of this verse. And the verse says that God has anointed him, speaking about Jesus, God has anointed him with the oil of gladness above all of his companions. Now, the oil of gladness, some translations say the oil of joy, above all of his companions. I think from that, what they're telling us, that Jesus had the most infectious personality of anybody on this earth.
He literally had joy dripping off of him.
It just oozed. It's not to say he didn't have the struggles in the garden.
Sure.
And the times that he was very serious and do things.
And
but for
frustrated,
3 years, the thing that characterized his life, that drew people to him, was this infectious, gracious words that would come from his mouth. And after making that comment one time, and we were having dinner with another couple, and after dinner she got up, she says, "Garth, I have a picture I want you to have." And so she gave me this picture, and it's the picture of a laughing Jesus. Now you go to internet, and we know everything on the internet's true.
True, of
right?
course.
You go to the internet and you plug in image of Jesus, and you get the porcelain version. It looks almost like you touch him and he'll break. The thing I think that characterized Jesus, such that even the little kids, kids don't go to grumpy people. Did you ever notice that? They go to people that are
Explains a
affectionate.
lot, really.
Yes. And so here is Jesus. He's laughing. I've taken that picture, and it's on my shelf in my office, and I just think about the gracious words that came from his mouth, and it captivated the people. And you think about when he would heal the blind man, and all of a sudden the blind man could see. Is Jesus just standing there stoic? The guy is jumping around, the lame man jumping around. He's never been able to walk. And all of a sudden he is he's just exuberating with excitement. I can see Jesus just joining in that and just being happy about it. And so it's one that if we have grace and we speak with grace, we'll have friends all the way the spectrum of people. Even the king will notice. But there are some cautions.
Yeah, we got to be careful. And, I think we should all aspire to be like Jesus in every way. And having joy dripping off of us is absolutely something to aspire to. But Proverbs is really good about telling us what not to do as well. So, 22:24, do not make friends with a hot-tempered person. Do not associate with one easily angered. We all know these people.
Yes.
And the very easy lesson to turn is not just avoid these people, avoid getting close to these people, but it's also don't be this person, right? So it's something we really need to watch for. That's not godly.
And another one here, when you get up in the morning, are you ready to go? Are you just exuberant?
Or not so much. Not until the coffee, no.
Not until the coffee. There are some people who are just ready to go the instant that they wake up. But there are other people, I need some space. There's a caution about these people. It says, one who blesses his friend with a loud voice early in the morning, it will be considered a curse to him. And so we have to be careful who we're talking to and how we act, even early in the morning with a blessing, because it can come across wrong. We've just got to be careful with things like that.
And we also have to make sure we don't wear out our welcome. Right? So Proverbs 25:17 talks about, let your foot rarely be in your neighbor's house, or he will become weary of you and hate you.
Okay.
That is to be avoided.
Yeah. Another caution. This is Proverbs 26. It says, like a maniac. There we go. Like a maniac who shoots flaming arrows and death. Firebrands is another word in one of the translations. Who shoots flaming arrows and death is a person who deceives his neighbor, pulls a trick on him, makes a joke about it or something, and realizes that he has upset him or whatever, and then he says, I was just joking. Well, sometimes jokes can backfire on you, and it's something that you hadn't intended at all, and maybe you did, I don't know, but certainly they can backfire, and it's something that deceives the neighbor to the extent that it comes across as a flaming arrow and maybe even death. Okay, the power of a tongue. Proverbs 16:28. A perverse person stirs up conflict, and a gossip separates close friends. Now, when we put a lesson together, first thing I do is to go to Bible Gateway, and I plug in the topic. I plugged in friend in this case, and then up comes all these particular verses. And like I said earlier on, there's about 12 or 14 of friend-type verses in the book of Proverbs. And this is one of them. And so up comes this, and we have to think about, all right, what do we say about this particular verse? A perverse person stirs up conflict, and a gossip separates friends. I guess it's important, Brian, to make the point that we can have an impact on others, even to the extent we can have the impact on two people that are friends. And it's not only this relationship, but a relationship between two other people. And there's a verse that came to mind about this, and it's Romans 4:7. It says, "Blessed are those whose lawless deeds have been forgiven, and whose sins have been covered." Now, we all know and have probably read this verse, and for me, I always would read this and think about it very personally. And that is, blessed are those whose lawless deeds have been covered and forgiven. And I would want and be very thankful. Thank you, Lord, for doing that for me. But there's another side to this verse. And the other side of the verse is, we can be the one that's doing the forgiving. And we can be the one who can cover up mistakes for somebody else. Because, as the proverb says, a perverse person stirs up conflict, but and gossip separates friends. By not doing that, you're actually, if you know something that would actually hurt a relationship by covering it up, then you have fulfilled this. Blessed are those whose sins have been covered, and you were the one who covered it up. And so it's a chance for us to be, as the Beatitudes say, a peacemaker.
Peacemaker.
A peacemaker, right. Exactly. Okay, we're going to skip the story on this next slide, because we're probably running out of time, and my quality control expert has cautioned me on the time issue.
It's good you have one of those.
And so, if you really want to know the diamond story, I'll tell it to you sometime. Okay. How about warnings?
Yeah, this is really interesting. You know, we study so often in Bible classes about the church in Corinth and how messed up it was, and it's very easy for us to look at them and point lots of fingers when they have all the same type of challenges that each one of us have. But in this case, the passage that we're talking about here in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, they're comparing themselves to one another based on what type of spiritual gift they have. We already know that, you know, it was kind of chaos going on in the church there, and you had people that were bragging about, I've got this gift and I've got that gift, and Paul writes to them in 2 Corinthians 10, "For we do not presume to rank or compare ourselves with some of those who commend themselves," so those who are bragging on themselves and their own things, "but when they measure themselves by themselves and compare themselves with themselves, they have no understanding." This is a huge temptation that we all struggle with, that comparing ourselves, trying to measure ourselves up against somebody else. And it's something that everything in our culture seems to encourage and celebrate even.
It's the competitive nature,
competitive nature. I mean, there's competition. We have a whole industry, as Wes has pointed out any number of times, of advertising and marketing that's all about making us want what we don't have so that we'll go spend money. But that extends to so much of our lives, to the point that we continually spend our time comparing ourselves to others. When in fact, what is most healthy is instead of on comparing ourselves against others and see how we don't measure up and get angry about that, how much better would our relationships be if we followed Romans 1:12, where it says that we may be mutually encouraged by each other's faith, both yours and mine. That word there, encouraged, that is such a much better way to think about what an ideal friendship is really all about, is mutually encouraging one another. And he adds in here, by our faith, right? We're encouraging each other by our faith. That's a common bond that we all share as brothers and sisters together. So much better if we focus on that than how we don't measure up.
Yeah, you know, there's a Bible example of a competitive nature. And it showed up over a 3-year period of time. Seems like from almost the very beginning of the 12 that would walk with Jesus all the way up to what we know is the Last Supper in the upper room. It's still a topic at that. And you remember this story, and this comes now from the setting in John 21. Jesus has been crucified, and now he is on the shore in Galilee, up in Galilee. And the guys have been out all night long. They've been fishing. And they haven't caught anything. And they realize that it's Jesus finally on the shore. And they come out, and they have an exchange there. It's when Peter was asked by Jesus 3 different times, "Do you love me?" It's that setting. And it says in this text, Peter turned around and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them. Now that would kind of suggest that they'd maybe gone for a walk. It's like after they finished their breakfast, that they got up and Jesus said, "We need to go for a walk." And so they're walking along, and Jesus turns to Peter and tells him how he's going to die. Well, I guess this competitive nature kicked in, because it says Peter turned around, saw the disciple whom Jesus loved, John, right? And asked, and turns out one of the reasons maybe that Peter was so adamant about this point, at the Last Supper, it says that the one had leaned on Jesus' chest at the supper. So John had been the one with a very private relationship right next to Jesus. And so here's Peter, and he's feeling this evidently. And so Peter, upon seeing him, said to Jesus, "Lord, what about this man? What about him?" And Jesus says something that is good for us all. Jesus said, "If I want him to remain until I come," wow, that'd be 2,000 years now. He said, "If I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me." Now, what does that tell us? That tells us that what we need to do is focus on our relationship with Christ, do what the ministry is that he gives us to do, and to basically encourage, like you say, everybody else, and don't worry about what everybody else is doing. And so you have that. He's just feeling that. Now, it's interesting that this story, you remember when we first find Jesus and his first miracle, he's at a wedding, and they've run out of wine, and Jesus fixes the party. These guys now, they had been fishing all night long. They had run out of fish. They hadn't caught a thing. And Jesus fixes the problem. These are like 2 bookend stories at the beginning of his ministry and the end of a ministry, where he solves an issue that is just a normal issue of life. And that's these gracious words, the graciousness of God. And so these 2 stories are bookends of the whole ministry of Jesus, of how he cared for people in their normal, everyday life.
And I thought of this passage when we first started talking about our topic this week. This notion of Proverbs 19, listen to advice and accept discipline so that you may be wise the rest of your days. These 2 passages, the Proverbs 19 and Proverbs 27, as iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. We regularly refer to these, or at least as I've noticed over the last few years, we've regularly referred to these, typically with things like men's ministry, because like you mentioned earlier with Brothers Keepers and Heartfelt Friends, this notion that getting us together as men and as women it's going to make us sharper. It's going to make us, there's a positive benefit of people of faith getting together and helping make people better. And that's the sense that I get from iron sharpening irons. It's, when I think about the Brothers Keeper ministry and those that have worked so hard to make that successful, it was all about trying to be better Christians, better dads, better husbands, better men. And there's something about that visual of, iron sharpening iron that really appeals to us that we can't do on our own nearly as well as we can do it with somebody else who loves us and is not judging us, but is helping us get better. Kind of like what Jesus was doing with Peter there.
Yeah. And with a little bit of friction sometimes involved, sometimes a little friction. And in fact, this past week, we've had a real life example of that, have we not?
We have.
We have. Gotten a little bit of trouble maybe. Let me say this about last week's lesson, okay? The purpose of last week's lesson was simply to show what was embedded in the Constitution, namely the biblical concepts that were there. The framers knew about other worldviews. They knew about the Eastern religions, other religions around the area where Israel was and things like that. And they looked across that and they knew about these things and other government styles, and they concluded that there was none superior to the things in the Bible, and especially the New Testament. And none of them were even close. And so our intended focus last week was on their final product and not on the lives of the people who formed it. And if we came across as not caring about the injustices that have been done down through time, we emphatically say we care. We care about the things that were done wrong. And not only that, we care about you, that we would not ever be so cavalier to take sensitive subjects and just brush them off. But that was not the intent of the lesson. The lesson's intent was simply to focus that lesson on the forming of the Constitution itself. Now, unfortunately, we didn't make that clear, and we're sorry about that. But there's some that took issue with us. But let me say this. What's the instruction when something like this happens? The Bible's very clear. The Lord's been very clear about it. The apostles later have been very clear about it, is that you get together and you talk. And that's exactly what's happened this past week.
Sure did.
We've had text, we've had emails, we've had phone calls, some of them several times with the same person, in order to figure out exactly what the issues are. And so this week, these texts and emails that have happened, at the end, we find out that we now are more sensitive to the situations, and we say thank you. Thank you so much for coming to us and saying, hey, this offended me, or this doesn't fit, or you shouldn't have done that. Because you were so open and came to us, it makes it so easy to address the problem and to work on it. It's iron sharpening iron is what it is. And so we just applaud you. And it's what I've been talking about earlier. And this is a healthy spirit of discontent, one that is required in order for progress to be made. I feel like we're closer. I know you and I are more sensitive, shall we say, to the situation, but certainly we did not intend to be cavalier about a very important subject, okay? Okay, one more slide and then our summary. Where is it?
Keep going. There you go.
There it is. This is the greatest friendship that's in the Bible. It's the greatest friendship that's in the world. Jesus said, I no longer call you servants, because a servant doesn't know what his master's business is. Instead, I've called you, and here's our word, I've called you friends. For everything that I learned from my Father, and we know that all the things that he spoke to the apostles and to the crowds, he said, these are things my Father has told me to tell you. He said, everything that I have learned from my Father, I have made known to you. And in Ephesians 1:9, we're reminded that he has made known to us the mystery of his will, something that was hidden from the foundation of the earth, but it was in God's mind and now had been revealed. And on top of that, it was something that they didn't even understand. But look at it this way. It was something that even the angels longed to look into. They didn't, even though they were in the presence of God, are in the presence of God, they are interested in this process. And angels looking for it. And it's interesting, and this is hard to grasp finally, and that is because God considers those who serve him to be his friend. And it's humbling to know that God uses imperfect people to accomplish what he wants to do. And he trusts us. He trusted the 12. One disappointed him. But we have Paul. We have others that were the fulfillment of this message, of getting the message out. And so we have this greatest friendship. And then it turns into something that more than a friendship, because now adoption, kin to God. And then finally, not only that, it says at the end, we are like him. And so this is a process that continues on. That's our story. That's the things about friendship that we see in the book of Proverbs. Brian, wrap us up on the summary.
And just continuing that thought, I mean, if you think about it, what was it? The charge that he laid on those apostles were to go into all the world, right? Mm-hmm. And that was, he entrusted and empowered his friends with the gospel. And that comes straight out of Mark chapter 3, verse 14. And he appointed the 12 so that they would be with him.
Yes.
And that he could send them out to preach. So that whole 3 years was to prepare his friends for that purpose. And therefore, our friends can help us with our mission, whatever that is. We've all been called, we've all been given a gift, a talent, an ability for use in God's kingdom. And those that we choose to associate with closely can help us get there through that encouragement that we talked about earlier.
And it requires then our willingness to be a friend. Not only do we have friends help us, but we have to help other people. And we have the instructions here in Proverbs on how to choose friends, how to be a friend, and how to be careful of what we do around friends. And finally, I'm going to leave you with this quote. It's a quote from Elizabeth Foley, who was a writer, but she said something that seemed to fit, and so I've stuck it in right at the last minute here, and that is, friendships double your joy and divide your grief. That when you're excited about something, your friends help you build that. That's the reason why we have parties. And when there is struggles, you call for help and a friend to come and be with you and sit with you. And that is the power of a friendship.
Indeed.
And good friends will stick closer than a brother.
Indeed.
So that's our lesson for today. Thank you for joining us. We appreciate you, and we love you, and look forward to seeing you and maybe someday hugging you like a friend as soon as all this is over.
Indeed.
Okay, bye-bye.
Amen.